And now, a passage from Americans in Eastern Asia by Tyler Dennett from Chapter 2, The Ports of Asia and the Pacific. As we follow the American vessels to Asia, we note that there were two possible routes, around the Cape of Good Hope or around Cape Horn and westward across the Pacific. The eastward route was usually selected by the larger Indiamen from Philadelphia, New York, Providence, and Massachusetts, which engaged in the direct trade with India or with China. This route also offered many advantages to the tramp, which depended in part on cargoes offered from port to port. In any case, the route lay across the Indian Ocean, past the Malay Peninsula, and up the China Sea. Ports along the way invited attention and were, in fact, a necessity for the replenishing of ships' stores, if not for trade. Ile-de-France and India. The American trade with Ile-de-France, Mauritius, opened in April 1786, when the Grand Turk arrived with an assorted cargo evidently intended to meet the needs of the French settlement. The ship was then chartered to the extent of 2/3 of the space by a Frenchman to carry freight to Canton, the charterer agreeing to pay all the port charges. The Grand Turk returned to Salem in May 1787 with a cargo of tea, ox hides, chamois skins, buckskins, wine, muslins, and bandana handkerchiefs. Derby followed up the Mauritius and Indian trade, and finding it more profitable than that with Canton, devoted himself to it during the last 8 years of his life. When he died in 1799, he was reported to be possessed of $1 million, the largest fortune in the United States. Commerce with Mauritius reached its height in 1800. There were 17 arrivals at Salem alone from Mauritius in the years 1797 and 1798. The Mauritius trade has an interest aside from its intrinsic value, for it was largely through the action of the French government in extending the hospitality of the French ports in the Indian Ocean to American ships in 1783, and informally opening them to American trade the next year, that the ports of British India were thrown open to Americans on especially favorable terms. Indian produce had become available to American vessels at the French ports. The Dutch and the Danes also were friendly to the Americans, and they also had settlements in India. There were, besides, the ports of the native princes. It was the policy of Great Britain, with her own nationals, to control the trade in such a way that all produce exported from India would either be imported to England or at least pay toll in London, but international competition made it impossible to maintain such a monopoly against American ships. The Americans would get the cargoes in any case. The East India Company, therefore, notwithstanding the fact that no commercial treaty existed with the United States, and in spite of such rancor and jealousy as remained from the late war, determined not only to admit American vessels to British India, but even to offer special inducements to bring them there. The first American ship to enter an Indian port was the Chesapeake of Baltimore. The vessel had been built especially for the trade and was commanded by her owner, Captain John O'Donnell, who had brought the Pallas into New York in 1784. The Chesapeake cleared, probably from Norfolk, in the latter part of 1786 and returned to Perth Amboy in 1789. She was warmly welcomed in India, the Supreme Council of Bengal exempting her as a mark of special favor from all customs duties. Lord Cornwallis and the government of India issued an order that American ships at the East India Company settlements should be treated in all respects as the most favored foreigners. This policy was confirmed in the commercial treaty with Great Britain in 1794, Article 13. The privileges secured were even greater, for Americans paid only 6% import duties, the same as those paid by the English, whereas other nations paid 8%. Furthermore, the Americans were exempted from the 2% export duty, which was paid by all others except the British. And then, although the Treaty of 1794 limited the trade in American vessels to direct trade with American ports, special licenses were issued permitting Americans to carry Indian produce to other ports of the Indian Ocean and to China, thus linking the peninsula in those circuitous voyages to which American ships were so well adapted. Derby of Salem had 4 vessels in the Indian Ocean in 1787. They visited Surat, Bombay, and Calcutta. They carried, among other commodities, Bombay cotton to Canton and brought Indian cotton to Salem. Derby's son returned from the East in 1791 after a residence of 3 years in which he had directed a very lively trade which reached from Bombay to Canton and was reported to have made $100,000 on his various transactions. The Betsy of Baltimore, the Commerce of Philadelphia, and the Leda of Boston all visited India in the season of 1786-7. While exact evidence is lacking, it is probable that before 1790, the total American tonnage in the Indian ports exceeded that at Canton. The American tariff of 1816 imposed a protective duty on coarse cottons, setting on them a minimum valuation of 25 cents a yard, the effect of which was to place the India trade under a severe handicap. Nevertheless, a certain amount of commerce continued. In the season of 1829-30, there were 16 vessels with a tonnage of 4,941 tons clearing from British India ports, and the following year, 19 vessels. The India trade, which had dwindled as the Americans learned to manufacture their own cottons, picked up again in the 2 decades which preceded the Civil War. The American tonnage at Calcutta in the second half of the year 1845 was 8,889 tons, 19 vessels, almost all of it being from Boston or elsewhere in New England. The inward cargoes at Calcutta consisted of lumber, cotton goods, and ice, the outward cargoes being made up chiefly of hides, saltpeter, indigo, and opium. The ice trade with Calcutta had been initiated in 1835 and came just in time to preserve Boston's East India commerce from ruin. In 1857, 152 American vessels departed from British India ports with cargoes valued at $11 million. The appointment of an American consul in India was a subject of consideration very soon after the close of the Revolution. Captain O'Donnell of the Chesapeake had applied for a position as General Commissioner for the United States for the Far East. He desired authority to negotiate trade agreements with the principal independent powers of Asia, which he described as Tipu Saib, son of Hyder Ali, the Marathas on the coast of Malabar, the King of Aceh in Sumatra, and the Malay King of Ternate. He also outlined a plan by which British merchants in India would be able to evade the rules of the company monopoly by shipping their fortunes to the United States under the protection of blank passports issued by O'Donnell. To this plan, John Jay reported to the Continental Congress, somewhat testily, that if residents of India were to come to the United States, their coming should be accomplished by means perfectly unexceptional and not by the sovereign of this country giving false evidence of American property to vessels, officers, and crews entirely foreign to the United States. The request was denied. As for treaties with the independent powers of Asia, the Continental Congress was too much preoccupied even to entertain the idea. Political connections with Asia, so long as ports were open and trade reasonably free, was farthest from the thoughts of the American people. The necessity for a consul at Calcutta increased, especially to care for American sailors at a time when American vessels were being sold in Indian ports. George Cabot of Boston, November 16, 1792, in a letter to President Washington, urged the importance of appointing a consul and mentioned the very precarious tenure of American rights in India. He thought that an agent on the spot might be able to accomplish something by availing ourselves as much as possible of the competition which existed between the rival French, Dutch, Danish, and English interests. Cabot, as well as many other Massachusetts merchants, recommended the appointment of Benjamin Joy of Newburyport and Boston. The appointment was made, and Mr. Joy reached Calcutta in 1794. He engaged William Abbott, the secretary to the Nabob of Arcot, to act as consular agent and vice-consul at Madras, but was unable to find a suitable person to serve in Bombay. Joy was received cordially by the British government, but without orders from London, he could not be recognized as consul. Consul Joy remained in India less than 2 years and resigned his commission from Boston January 24, 1796. Two successors were appointed in 1796 and in 1801, respectively, one from Philadelphia and the other from Massachusetts. But it does not appear that either of them ever entered upon the duties of the office. The next consul was James B. Higginson of Massachusetts, who entered upon his work in 1843. The India trade of the United States was entirely without political significance. However, the close association of American and British merchants in both the direct India-American and in the India-Canton trade exercised an influence on American policy in China, for it brought the Americans and the English together at Canton and accounted for the disposition of many of these merchants to seek common action in 1839 and later.